The Psychic type, a type that used to dominate in the early generation of Pokemon, quickly fell from its throne of being the greatest to one that is deemed below average. How did this type, that was ahead of its time, fall victim to time itself? Let's take a closer look at Psychic, the type mismanaged by the numbers. Let's start by looking at Psychic type properties to see why it currently has such a bad reputation. In Generation 1, the Psychic type was super effective against 2 types, one of which was Poison, the most commonly seen type in the Kanto region, with 33 separate appearances. Psychic is also able to resist 2 types, gets resisted by only one, which was itself, had only one weakness, which was Bug, who by the way had the lowest average base stat total amongst final stage evolution in this region. And if this wasn't enough, there was a coding mistake that had the Psychic type be immune to Ghost type in this region instead of being a weakness. So basically, the only way to not lose to a Psychic type Pokemon in Kanto was to use a Psychic type Pokemon. Similar to how Dragon type felt mainly in Generation 4 and 5 before the introduction of the Fairy type. But then we see some changes in the Psychic type in Generation 2 that absolutely decimates this type's usages in battle. It gains no new super effective options or resistances. It does however now get resisted by the newly introduced Steel typing, and its immunity to Ghost now becomes one of its weaknesses, alongside an additional weakness from the Dark typing. And if that wasn't enough, the Psychic type is a complete liability when it comes to fighting Dark type Pokemon. So now we're caught up to speed of how the Psychic type was nerfed over the years. But what about the Psychic Pokemon that were being introduced? Are they still producing them at the same level in Kanto? Have they got better or have they got worse? While looking at the Kanto region, 14 Psychic type Pokemon were released. Just know, this following calculation is only involving regular and regional form Pokemons, so any Megas or alternative form Psychic Pokemon will not be accounted for. They will have their own separate section later on in this video. These 14 Psychic Pokemon have an average base stat of 457, which was the second highest in Kanto, only behind Ice. But that was because all Ice Pokemon from Kanto were final stage Pokemon. When looking at all fully evolved Pokemon from Kanto, Psychic had a base stat of 524, placing behind a monstrous Fire type and Dragon, who only had Dragonite. Continuing on, we have the Johto region that released 10 Psychic Pokemon who on average had a similar base stat total to Kanto at 459, where instead of Mew and Mewtwo, it had Celebi and Lugia. However, don't be fooled by these legendary Pokemon, as despite being on average slightly stronger than Kanto, the Johto region had the lowest average base stat total when looking only at fully evolved Psychic type Pokemon compared to any other region, with an average base stat of 501. Up next is the Hoenn region, which had the largest influx of Psychic type Pokemon, with a record of 20 new Psychic types, with a good portion of them being very powerful. In spite of all this, the sub-tier pre-evolved Mons that came alongside them in this region allowed Hoenn to produce an average base stat of 432 for the Psychic type. We see an inverse of this in the next generation of Sinnoh, being the first region to introduce a single-digit amount of Psychic type Pokemon at 9. They also had a fair share of legendary Pokemon, without all the drawbacks of pre-evolution, causing this region to have an average base stat total of 470. On to Unova, where we see a similar situation to Hoenn, and where a large pool of Pokemon causes a lower average base stat total. Unova released the second most amount of Psychic types at 15, who on average had the lowest average base stat at 424, when compared to the averages of all regions. Even if we were to just look at only fully evolved Pokemon, Unova's average would be at 508, the third lowest out of all regions. Overall, Unova was underwhelming in terms of Psychic type Pokemon. Moving on, we get the Kalos, the smallest region that released the fewest amount of Psychic type Pokemon at only 6, which on average had a tame base stat value of 454. But then we get to Alola, possibly the best region for Psychic type Pokemon to thrive in, releasing a total of 8 Pokemon, half of whom were powerful legendaries, causing Psychic to have the highest average base stat total of any region at 512. Even when looking at just fully evolved Pokemon, it still came out on top at 583. And by the way, this is all done without Necrozma's 3 additional forms of Duskmane, Dawnwing, or Ultra Necrozma. After Alola, we get to Galar, who released 9 Psychic type Pokemon, who had a mild base stat average of 445. It's not completely horrible, but it could be much better. But of course, Ice Rider and Ghost Rider Calyrex forms aren't included for this calculation, as they are viewed as alternate forms. But they do however have a lot of usage in competitive play. And finally, we get to Paldea, releasing a total of 11 Psychic types, 10 of whom are already final stage Pokemon. This heavy array of fully evolved Mons allows Paldea to have an average base stat total of 512. almost as high as Alola. But the weird thing about all this is that despite the recent releases of powerful psychic Pokemons, the average base stat amongst all of them is still 457, which is exactly identical to the average base stat they had back in Generation 1. Now of course, when accounting for the 9 regional variant psychic type Pokemons as well, the average base stat value amongst them comes to 458. This great value allows them to rank 4th amongst averages of all type, and remain 4th on base stat averages of all type for fully evolved Pokemons, with a base stat total of 526. Now, this may seem good on paper since you are top 4 amongst all types for both all Pokemon and just fully evolved Pokemon, until you realize this is actually a decrease in their ranking from their Kanto standings, where it was 2nd in average base stat of all Pokemon and 3rd highest average of fully evolved Pokemon. The reason its ranking decreased despite staying the same is because the Pokemon with this typing had no growth while other types did. The average Psychic in Kanto had a base stat of 457, now it's 458, a 1 point increase. The average amongst all Pokemon was 408 back in Kanto, now it's 428, a 20 point increase. And if Psychic Pokemons aren't the ones getting stronger throughout the years, then that means other types are, making Psychic Pokemons relatively weaker compared to other types as time moves on. This is also seen with fully evolved Pokemon, as Psychic only had a 2 point increase from its initial point to now. But when looking at all Pokemon of all type, the average fully evolved Pokemon went from having a base stat value of 491 to now 508, a 17 point increase. Clearly, Psychic isn't getting much love compared to other types when it comes to receiving stronger Pokemon, as it has remained very stagnant. This really doesn't help at all with the fact that the number of Psychic type Pokemon being released per generation has also been decreasing, but one can easily blame the decrease in overall Pokemon for that one, as the total concentration of Psychic type Pokemon went from 9.3% in Kanto to about 10% now, a very marginal increase, which is possibly only achieved since the frequency of dual typing has increased over the years. When adding the 9 out of 55 regional form Psychic type into the count, the Psychic type ends up with a concentration of about 10.3%, all in all showing that the Psychic type hasn't had much changes when it comes to overall strength or distribution since their initial appearance. Even the Psychic type shtick has been the same from the start. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about its playstyle in battle. Almost all Psychic type Pokemon has more special attack than attack, so they are more centered toward being built as a special attacker. This doesn't help with the fact that most Psychic type moves are labeled as being a special attack, so it's easily predictable to stop Psychic type attackers by using special walls. This is similar to how Fighting type has mainly physical attackers with physical attacks, so they are stopped by using physical walls. The only difference being that Psychic is super effective against 2 types, while Fighting is good against 5, which allows Fighting to have more chances to bypass walls, especially considering that physical walls are mostly possessing rock and steel typing. You know, types that Fighting deals super effective damage to. On the other hand, it's very rare do you ever encounter a special tank that has a weakness to Psychic type attacks. And if being predictable on your build wasn't bad enough, Psychic type Pokemon also have a very underwhelming move pool as well. The Psychic type had 2 notable attacks for most of its existence, those being Psychic of course, which came out back in Generation 1, and Psyshock, a move that came out in Generation 5, which is a slightly weaker variant of Psychic, but damages based on their defense rather than their special defense, allowing it to get around some special walls as previously mentioned. Alongside these 2 attacks, they have a plethora of status moves to alter the battle, such as Light Screen, Reflect, Swapping and Splitting moves, even Rooms and Tricks, all having a unique effect that may or may not benefit you in battle. It all just depends on your team composition and the opposing player's Pokemons as well. Psychic also tends to have a heavy array of exclusive moves that are only used by a select few Pokemon, such as Mewtwo with Psystrike, the Eon Duo having their own unique Psychic type attack, Deoxys with Psycho Boost, the Lake Trio with Mystical Power, Cresselia with 2 lunar moves, Hoopa with Hyperspace Hold, Necrozma with Photon Geyser and Prismatic Laser, Galarian Slowking with Eerie Spell, Galarian Articuno with Freezing Glare, Hisuian Braviary with Esper Wing, Gwardier with Psy Shield Bash, Espathra with Lumina Crash, Farigirath with Twin Beam, and Iron Leaves with Psyblade. If this wasn't enough, Mew also had his very own Z move called
Genesis Supernova.
Quite a lot, but this doesn't really help out the Psychic type as a whole. In reality, the only common move that came out for Psychic type in recent years that has some usage in battle is Expanding Force. However, its requirements are situational and mainly only ever used in double battle format, but more on that when we talk about Psychic type role in competitive Pokemon. But overall, the Psychic type hasn't had much changes to its stats, playstyle, or moves throughout the franchise's history, which is bad since the games are always expanding on new Pokemon and mechanics that will keep things fresh. But if a type isn't able to keep up with the rest, then slowly it just won't get used. So let's look at a few things a Psychic type does to keep itself relevant despite everything else that has been discussed thus far. In Wolfie's video of best dual type combination, the 3 lowest ranked Psychic combinations were Psychic Dark, Psychic Grass, and Psychic Rock. In total, these 3 combinations make up 8 out of 52 final stage dual type Psychic Pokemon. Just know, if all types were distributed evenly, there should be around 3 final stage dual Psychic Pokemon for each possible typing, meaning that the bottom 3 is expected to have 9 Pokemon, but since they have fewer than that much, then it's a good thing. This is even shown on the other side with best combination. The top 3 were Psychic Water, Psychic Fire, and Psychic Steel, which comes out to a total of 13 final stage Pokemon, which is way above and beyond the expected amount of 9. And with this large portion of Psychic type Pokemon being paired with favorable typing, it allows them to claw itself out of its hole of being a disastrous type, something that Grass and Bug failed to do. If you're interested in hearing more about that, check out my Bug by the Number video, and make sure to subscribe for future videos about the rest of the types. Anyways, dual typing isn't the only thing keeping Psychic relevancy alive. The other thing keeping the Psychic type afloat are specialties. And what I mean by this are legendaries, mythical, megas, and alternate forms. It doesn't get talked about that often about how much these Pokemon are associated with the Psychic type, but this might be because Dragon is the #1 culprit of having all of these mons at an even more frequent level. In Generation 1, Psychic had the strongest Pokemon in the game in Mewtwo, alongside the mythical Mew. In Johto, they yet again had a powerful legendary alongside a mythical. Gen 3, it had multiple legendary and mythicals. And if that wasn't enough, there was also a pseudo-legendary, and Deoxys is able to alternate between 3 forms to best suit your needs for a team. Gen 4 introduced 4 legendaries with the Lake Trio plus Cresselia. Gen 5 had 2 mythical Pokemon. In Gen 6, there was only Hoopa, which did have an alternate form. Luckily enough, this was the generation that introduced Mega Evolution. And if you didn't know, the Psychic type has the record for introducing the most amount of Mega Pokemons at 10. Even beating out Dragon, which had 9. And half of these Psychic type Megas were able to hit the base stat total mark of 700 or higher. In Generation 7, the main 3 legendaries were all associated with the Psychic type. Furthermore, Necrozma also had 3 alternative forms that were all stronger than Necrozma's base form, while still pertaining its Psychic typing. Generation 8 only had Calyrex, which in itself isn't that good, but its 2 alternate forms are absolute units. And finally, Gen 9, which had the Paradox version of the Sword of Justice trio, who despite not actually being labeled as legendary Pokemon, did have more stats than their original counterparts. Anyways, this vast collection of powerful Psychic type Pokemon aids with the shortcoming of bad type properties, especially considering that a great portion of them have access to moves that are exclusively used by them, which leads us to our final question. How does all of this impact Psychic type performances when it comes to competitive Pokemon? Just know, the data collected for this part is from Pikalytics and was extracted on March 9th, 2025. Pokemon usages could have increased or decreased from when you are watching this video. We'll start by looking at the Uber tier, probably the format where the Psychic type has the greatest impact due to its amazing artillery of legendary Pokemon. You can even get away with some cheesy strategies such as Shadow Tag Gothitelle and Stored Powered Espathra, although there are much more powerful Pokemon that could be used in this tier. The Psychic type was able to take up 5 spots in the top 20 most used Pokemon for the Uber format. This makes it the most commonly seen type in the top 20, even beating out Fairy, who had a total of 4 appearances. So why are they able to have this outcome? One reason is, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is the legendaries. But Dragon has as much, if not even more legendary and powerful Pokemon, yet they're not dominating the usage list. Now of course, you can just argue that Koraidon being in 75% of teams plays a factor in that, as players tend to not use duplicate types. But another reason is because Fairy, the second most common type, has a large presence in this format, which is Dragon's Kryptonite. But we don't see the same thing for Psychic, as only 1 Dark type Pokemon exists in the top 20. This is because Dark type lacks strong legendary Pokemons, as mentioned in my Dark type video. And without Psychic #1 enemy prohibiting it from succeeding, it's able to be a compelling choice when creating teams for Ubers with their highly offensive orientated Pokemon. But the same thing can't be said in the other formats, where both their usages are down and their role is less based on being a killer and more on supporting. That is, if it even has a role at all. In Little Cup, a format that involves unevolved Pokemon, the Psychic type was the second latest Pokemon to see an appearance, with Gothita, which was only ahead of the Dragon type Axew. You know, the two types that is abundant in legendaries, struggle to carve a path in battle when those are taken away from them. It also doesn't help that the most common attack seen in this format is Knockoff, petrifying the option to have a Psychic type Pokemon in your team. In Monotype, a format that requires a team that is compromised of the same type, struggles to show Psychic type having any value. The type doesn't even have their 6 most used Pokemon of the type have a 2% usage rate. And to make things worse, none of these 6 Pokemon recommended team is the Psychic type. They are instead put into a team with the other type they are associated with, rather than the Psychic type itself. Looking at the most used Pokemon that has a Psychic type team recommendation, we see Slowbro, a Pokemon with less than 0.4% usage rate. So if you're a fan of Psychic type, don't take your talent to Monotype format. It won't end well. Now finally, let's look at VGC Best of 3 Regulation Set F Showdown. Psychic type Pokemon only really have one main role in this format, and that's to cut off priority moves. This is done so with mainly 2 Pokemon. The first one is Farigiraf, whose ability of Armor Till prevents the use of priority moves, paired up with the move Trick Room that lets slower Pokemon such as Farigiraf itself get the first attack. The other way Psychic type Pokemon cuts off the use of priority move is by using Indeedee, who has the ability Psychic Terrain, which has the effect of nullifying priority moves and boosting Psychic type attacks, especially the move Expanding Force, which I didn't talk about before, but I will now. Expanding Force is a move of 80 base power with a very situational effect. If Psychic Terrain is active, this move hits both target and deals more damage. By the way, Psychic Terrain is already boosting the damage, so when these two effects are stacked together, Expanding Force has a base power of 156. Basically, double the damage and double the targets. Indeedee makes full use of this strategy as its most used teammate is Iron Crown, a Pokemon that uses the move Expanding Force in its moveset. However, it's unfortunate that the most used Pokemon in VGC happens to be one that is immune to Psychic type attacks. Both Farigiraf Armor Tail and Indeedee Psychic Surge has their own pros and cons, but the effect of removing priority, even if it's only momentarily, allows a Psychic type to have an interesting role when in the VGC. So, what do you guys think? Do you think this type that was once above all can ever flourish again without using lucrative tactics such as needing alternative forms and unique attacks, or is it doomed to fail due to its awful type properties and lack of powerful mons outside of legendaries, and remain the type mismanaged by the numbers?